I really think about when I was in second grade and they were really focusing on how to create a story. And they talked about there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. I really think yesterday was about the beginning. It's like, how have we gotten to where we are? And I think we are in the middle of this story. And so even though we're calling it Casey Today, today is really just the middle. And it's important what happens in the middle because that gives some insight into what the end will look like, what tomorrow will look like. But the key is tomorrow is based upon you guys. And we really hope that you think about what are the lessons we learned from today, how did they build on the past such that you can create Casey's tomorrow. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Steph. The day is really straightforward. We're going to talk about your homework. Hope you guys wrote your essays. We're going to have an opportunity for Patrick to kind of share his perspective of today. You'll get an opportunity to ask him questions. And then you guys loved the panel so much yesterday, we thought we would do round 2 of panels, but we brought different folks in. We'll end with some questions and answers and discussion among you, and then we'll have lunch and we'll call Casey Today module complete. Once again, our results for today were, what are the current values and beliefs and how are they observed in today's work? How have the lessons from our past experiences influenced our current work? And finally, what challenges and competing priorities make it difficult to consistently apply our lessons and our values? So those are the results we're seeking for today. Hopefully you guys are as open, honest, and conversive as yesterday. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. So we're going to start today. Last night you were given a homework assignment to do some personal reflection on what the key values, beliefs, and lessons that you've heard various people talk about have stood out to you and why you think those are important to your work. So we're going to start today with a check-in and discussion based on that question. And we're going to actually do our check-in at tables. So we're going to start with some table conversations, and then we're going to do some whole group report out. So what I'm going to ask you to do in your tables is to answer 2 questions that are written over there. I'll drag that over. But basically just, well, one, if you move tables and you don't know all the people at your table, you should introduce yourself. And then 2, just answer, how are you doing this morning? And then answer the reflection question. So what are the values, beliefs, and lessons that you've heard about that resonate most with you and seem most important to your work, and why? So I'm going to give the tables about 5 to 7 minutes to discuss the question. Normally when we do this, we would have flip charts at your table so you could be taking notes and everyone could see them, but I decided we would do this on the fly. So I don't have flip charts, but we do have pads of paper at your table. So I would ask you to identify one person at your table who could take notes and then be willing to report out briefly to the group after. So we'll have the table conversations, then we'll do one person reporting out from each table, just summarizing what you've heard, and then we'll have a little whole group conversation. Any questions? Okay, so you have 5, I'll check in with you in 5 minutes to see if you're close to wrapping up. All right, so I'll pull the 2 questions over. Okay, I'm going to ask you guys to just wrap up your conversations in the next 30 seconds. Okay, We're going to bring it back now to a whole group conversation. So sounded like you guys were having very interesting conversations. So I'm excited to hear what you guys have to share with the whole group. Okay, so I'm going to let any table decide to start, and whoever wants to start, just let me know. And just ask you to talk for maybe about 2 minutes, just a little summary of what came up in your group. So who would like to start? Okay, we'll start with Yvette.
Good morning, everyone. These thoughts are the collective thoughts of our table here. And some of the values and beliefs that resonated with our group was around risk-taking, working hard, and the importance of relationships and partnerships. Essentially, relationships matter. Some of us felt that as new employees to the organization that we really felt empowered to really hold on to our own truths and what we believed in as we began to move this work forward. And specifically, John's comments about knowing which battles to pick was really important because there is so much going on within the agency that it's easy to make mistakes. And more importantly, the idea of do no harm. That as we go out into the field and work with communities and systems particularly, that we try to leave those systems in a better situation than we found them. And if we're not able to do that, we probably need to step away. And so do no harm was another big thing that came out of that. And lastly, respect the community's knowledge. We're not the end-all and be-all. We don't know everything. And that the areas that the community can affect change for themselves and their families, we need to allow them to do that. And I think the example around safety, public safety in one community really spoke to us that, you know, the question was asked, well, you know, Casey's Casey, so why didn't we do that? Why didn't we address that? And we're like, they got that. There was no need to address it. So we let them do what they had strengths in doing, and we brought something additional to the table to really turbo boost our efforts, if you will. The other issue was around the staff to endowment ratio and the balance between thinking and doing. And I would just add to that in terms of that comment that, you know, we are the resource that goes out, unlike some other foundations and charities that just send the money out and say, okay, you do it. Through our method, I would say we actually have some skin in the game because we are joined with our partners in the community so that we are successful versus here's the money, now let's see how well you do. With us being partners, you know, with the communities, we have a stake. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And which table would you like to go next, Yvette? You get to pick.
You saw my face looking at my team like, oh, I get to pick?
Yeah, you get to pick.
Okay. Everybody's turning around.
So our table actually found that we shared a lot of very, strong commonalities in terms of what we took away from yesterday's session as well as our short experience here. And the first value that multiple people mentioned was respect. And there's both kind of an external element as well as internal. There's a sense that Casey gives respect to, sincere respect to other people's ideas, to communities that they work with, and naturally and easily receives respect in return. Respect is also manifest internally. We feel that the organization really respects and values the contribution of each staff person, and that in turn motivates people to want to contribute. The second value that we spoke about is pride in the foundation, reputation, image, and the integrity of the work that they're doing. In particular, the data-driven orientation and good work that is recognized widely.
Can you just restate that one again? I'm sorry.
Sure, pride in the image and reputation and integrity of the work done by the foundation. The third value was humility and the sense of privilege that people have in being afforded the opportunity to do work that is, has integrity, focused on the most noble objective of improving children's lives. And then the fourth value was diversity. We were all struck by the level of diversity within the staff at the foundation and the willingness to talk about it openly.
Great, thank you. Which table would you like to go next?
All right, so we too talked about the integrity of the work and how the panel really impressed us, particularly in the willingness to admit on camera mistakes and differences with each other and with the leadership of the foundation and with major initiatives and decisions that were made. And then we also talked about really feeling the need to balance humility with our expertise and how that came through yesterday, the notion that the foundation's so conscious of the need to enter communities respectfully and really learning all the time, and yet to move forward with purpose when we really have a belief that we can make change to really go with that, but in this careful way and trying to balance those two priorities. And I added from my lens, communicating that to the world is really difficult, and I think a continuing challenge for some initiatives in particular. We talked a little more about the notion of failure and its importance to our work, and not only to our work as a foundation, but kind of the work we're asking communities, families, and kids to do. The idea that you can fail in a safe space to grow, and that that's important here in what we're doing. We're asking systems to take those kinds of risks, and we need to be mindful of the fact that they too will perhaps slide back before they move forward, and being conscious of that in everything I think we thought was important. And finally, we found meaningful Doug's notion of sort of considered ignorance and the important role that plays in catalyzing change and asking fresh questions, bringing our new eyes, and particularly since we're all new, to kind of use that productively and not be afraid to ask questions or maybe productively challenging our seasoned peers in their thinking. So thanks.
Thanks, Kate. So I guess your choice is easy of who's going to go next.
It's always tough to go last in these. But in an effort not to repeat, I'll just list the ones that were already said. Stephanie, you can put a check mark by them if you want. We also had relationships matter, and making connections with people and how that influences the work. We also had respect for community knowledge. We also had a spirit of humility. Looking for things that are different. Okay, some things that haven't been stated. We had having patience with the work and kind of this understanding that there's no quick fix, and sticking through the years with a certain project, and how the kind of dedication and commitment, which was evident in yesterday's panel, considering they've been here for a long time. It speaks to that. We also had to have big goals, dream big, and how that's important to the work. And in addition, leadership matters. Donna kind of touched on that, and how that wasn't really a big aspect of the foundation earlier, but kind of became and grew into a really big part of the work that we do today. Additionally, we also talked about how it relates to our work. And one thing we noticed was that although we have different roles, it's still, we may identify with a different value or belief, but it's all pretty much connected and related. And at different times and through different parts of the work, we may be impacted, or our work may be influenced by a different value, but it's like all related.
Great. Thank you, guys. So just kind of taking a look at some of the things that that were talked about. I think it seemed like a lot of you did have commonalities. Common things came up in your tables. I know some of the things that are sticking out for me of what you guys said is this importance of respect and the idea of how that translates to our internal work with each other and how we operate, how our culture is here at the foundation, and then in our work, how that's translating externally. I think we're going to hear a little bit about that today also from our panelists. And just these ideas about failure and mistakes, and I heard people really appreciating the willingness for the panel yesterday to share that no, not everything went the way that we planned, and we can admit that, and things didn't always turn out perfect, but the importance of that is what could we learn along the way and how we could apply that. So I heard that come up yesterday in reflections and then again today. So at this point, I'm actually going to turn it over to Patrick, who's going to provide some of his thoughts about overall vision for Casey, and then following him, we'll have an awesome panel discussion. So I'm going to give this to Patrick.
Good morning. So I have a confession to make. I'd much rather continue listening to this conversation than have you listen to my piece here, because I don't often get this chance to kind of hear folks who are brand new to the foundation. You know, as Doug said, when somebody walks into a room and they've never been in that room before, they sort of notice the curtains in a different way than when you walk into the room all the time. So, but I want to share with you some of my perspective on where we are today. And where I want to start will echo a lot of what you said, because I want to talk about what at least I see as baked into the DNA of this place. You know, what really makes us, in my view, special. And I think we are a very special place. So there are kind of four things, and they'll remind you of things you've already said. But for me, they sort of get lifted up. To start with, this notion of data matters, results matters, evidence makes a difference. That shouldn't be such a big deal, right? But in fact, if you look around the field, you'll see that's not often the case. We often ourselves, as well as many of our partners, follow our guts or just say, well, we know this or that. Unfortunately, a lot of what we know turns out not to be true. So that notion that data makes a difference, that results really matter, and that increasingly as we do our work, we're going to bring the best available evidence to bear, asking lots of questions before we make decisions, is something that I think really helps this organization stand out from lots of other organizations. And if we lose that, we're in trouble. So I'm counting on you to help us do that. The second theme, and I think it's in some of these values, is we're a place that thrives, excuse me, let me get my water. I just always get so choked up about data. That we're a place that thrives on innovation. We obviously have a long history. We've worked in a lot of the same fields for a long time. As you heard, we continue to work on things. So you can come in and at first sort of think, well, you know, this is a place that doesn't like to take risks, et cetera, until you look at some of our history and realize that back in the early 90s when the juvenile detention work started, it was a time when most folks were saying you ought to be locking more kids up, not fewer. So this was kind of a big risk. You know, foundations have this huge advantage of having flexible resources, and although we're accountable to our board, compared to some of the pressures that folks in politics and in government have to balance, folks in business have to balance, we actually have this huge flexibility. And if we don't use that, if we don't take risks, if we don't think of that as risk capital, then we probably ought to be in a different business. Right? So the innovation is important. The notion of patient capital, you heard a lot about that yesterday. Try something, make a little bet first, and that probably won't work, but you'll learn. You go on to the next bet and the next bet. But don't walk away too soon. There are so many times when we could have walked away saying, well, that was sort of okay, but it's not really doing. No, we kept going back and saying, this is too important a problem to let go. So part of that innovation is having that patient capital. And the other piece, which I think you probably saw yesterday when you listened to John and Bart and Donna, a sense of entrepreneurship is part of that innovation. We count on every single staff person to be an entrepreneur, but in a special kind of a way. We count on every individual staff person being an entrepreneur who knows how to work with teams. So not a lone wolf, not somebody who goes galloping off saying, well, I've got the best idea that anybody ever thought of, but rather somebody who's constantly bringing new ideas to the whole team. So we want to be data-driven, results-oriented, evidence-based. We want to balance that with innovation, recognizing that we don't have evidence about everything, so we've got to add to that evidence by being innovative. Third, for me, this is our North Star, which is that we are all about family. And what we mean by that are a number of things. It's our particular niche as a foundation. There are not many foundations who are focused on children who also think about the family as a whole, knowing that if the family isn't successful, the kid's not going to be successful. But there's another way that we think about this, which is important, which is that it's one of these simple rules. We each believe, I don't think we'd be here if we didn't, that if some idea isn't good enough for our family, our own child, our own sister, our own mother, not good enough for us, then it's not good enough for all the families that we care about. So if somebody comes to us with a great idea, it's an intervention, we think, well, let's maybe invest in that. We ought to be doing it because we think that's what I'd want for my family. And if there's something we're working to decrease, in other words, if I don't want my son doing some knuckleheaded thing and getting arrested and going into detention when he doesn't need to be there, then that's one of our guide stars. Is it good enough for my family? Is it what I'd want for my family? And how hard would I work for it if it was my family? Is another piece of our DNA. And finally, and again, this was discussed in your table talk, this notion of social justice, fairness, equity, opportunity, all these things coming together. We have a long history in this country of not living up to the aspirations that we talk about. CASE is one of the organizations in this country who is trying to work hard to make sure that we in fact do better than we have in the past of living up to those aspirations. And that's about race. Yes, we need to talk about race all the time and everything that we do, because after all, it affects everything that we do. It's about ethnicity. It's about immigration. It's about basic fairness for folks who often have not received that kind of respect, to borrow from the organization's name, the kind of respect and support necessary so that everybody can participate in the opportunities that this country can provide. So that's kind of, again, you've heard all that, but for me, those are the four things when I think what makes CASE different, what's in our DNA. It's about the data, the innovation, the family focus, and this notion of social justice. So just like the rest of you, I have Thanksgiving dinner and have a relative say, so what does the CASE Foundation really do? And you know, I only have from the cranberry sauce through the parfait to answer that question. So I want to share with you my take about CASE today, and I think you'll see it, I hope, as kind of an evolution from where we've been. So you'll hear people talk about poverty, permanence, and place. That's just a kind of way to keep it in mind. But let me put that in terms that are a little more like what you talk about at Thanksgiving dinner. So around poverty, obviously a huge problem. Most of the bad outcomes that we see with children can be traced back to poverty. So therefore, finding a path out of poverty towards opportunity is a big deal. So how do we do that? What's the CASE contribution to that? Well, in simple terms, we help people find jobs. And we help employers find good workers. We help families plan for a better future for their children, and we help their children prepare for success through a good education. So that's kind of what we do. Help people find jobs, help them build the kind of assets they need to be successful, help their children be on a path towards a good education so they have opportunity. You'll, over time, start to become more and more familiar with the programs by which we do that. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just as a couple of examples, our Centers for Working Families, where we bring together the work to help people find jobs, build assets, plan for their future, access benefits they need to be successful, bundle them all together into one center. We are now trying to take that idea to all the community colleges around the country. So community college is a place where you can also get help for your family and get help for yourself to attach to the workforce and to be successful. We're also trying to embed that in Head Start programs. So we're trying to build to scale this idea as one of the paths out of poverty. For children, again, there's a lot of detail on this, but basically our grade level reading campaign. It's a notion that one of the most critical markers of whether a child's going to be successful in school or not is whether she's reading proficiently, not just adequately, but proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. So we're making a big deal about that because that puts a child on a path towards success. And then in terms of some of our newest work, we're just developing ideas, and you'll hear a lot of conversation about this, about 2-generation strategies that look at the developmental milestones that children go through as they grow up, and kind of matching that to the developmental milestones that young parents go through as a family is formed and as it grows. And how do you think about those in a more integrated kind of a way? Not sure we're going to end up with that. Maybe a dead end, we'll see. But it's a new kind of way of thinking about the 2-generation approach that we're working with a bunch of partners to figure out. So that's our quick skim over the poverty piece. I use the term permanence primarily because it starts with P, so it's easy to remember, and because a lot of our work is in child welfare, and that's a term that's used in child welfare a lot. But it can be a little bit of a distraction. What I really mean by permanence is, are we helping families be strong? So we know that lots of folks grow up in poverty. In fact, most folks who grow up in poverty do just fine. They don't have terrible outcomes. Why? Because they've got a strong family that helps them with resilience, that they can depend on when things are tough, they can reach out to. So that's why we care so much about family. Again, we say permanence because we're talking about a family for life, a family you can count on down the road. So you've heard a little bit about our family-to-family work. You'll hear more about our consulting work that we do to work with large systems to do a better job of supporting families. Some of the new work we're doing here has to do with bringing evidence-based practices to a much larger scale in ways that support families. So you'll hear about Evidence to Success, which is a community-based approach to do that. The third P is place, and that's because we know that if you live in a strong community, a community with good schools, a community that has recreational opportunities, that has networks that support your children, you're likely to do better than if you live in a community that doesn't have those kinds of resources. So we invest in trying to make communities a better place to raise kids. Some of our big investments are right here in Baltimore. We have a huge investment in East Baltimore. Over years, we've either through grants or through loans and capital investments, we've got over $100 million invested in making East Baltimore a successful community. Jury's still out on how we're going to do, but I think we're making great progress there. Similarly in Atlanta, which you've heard a bit about, we make big investments there. And then our new work here is in family-centered community change, where we're working as partners with 3 communities around the country that are already doing great things. We're going to try to work together with them to introduce ideas about 2-generation change into the work that they do. So those are the 3 Ps, and then underscoring all of that is what I think of as capacity building. So in addition to the poverty and permanence and place work we do through our grant making and our consulting and our technical assistance, et cetera, we also recognize that there are some things that cut across all of those areas. Leadership, for example. Leadership makes a huge, huge difference, and so we invest in supporting new leadership as it moves forward. We know that the ability to collect and use data and to use evaluation results makes a huge difference. We know that policy makes a huge difference. So part of the work that we do is to invest in all those kinds of areas in order to support the rest of the work that we do. So that's like kind of a big, broad, right? That's hardly, unless you're going up the Empire State Building and it's a very slow elevator, that's a very long elevator speech. But if you just keep in mind, we work on poverty and opportunity, we work on making families strong, we work on making communities good places to raise kids, and we recognize you've got to also do leadership work and policy work and evaluation work, et cetera, in order to make that successful. That's kind of where we are today, growing out of where we've been. That's very broad, right? So at the end of the day, we only have but so much money to invest. And we have a lot more ideas that come our way than we have money to support all of those ideas. So we have to sort them. We have to say, what are we going to do and what are we not going to do? And these are some of the toughest decisions that we make every day. I mean, every day when you come to work, you make a decision about what you're going to do that day, right? So what do we do? Well, here's another threesome. It's families, evidence, and scale. Families, we're going to invest in things that not only help children, but actually help to strengthen families. Lots of good things that go just solely focusing on children. We tend not to do as much of that as another Kids Foundation might. Not because we think it's a bad thing, but just because our particular approach is to help children by helping families become stronger. So the idea comes across our desk, we're much more likely to pay attention to it if it's got a piece to it that's going to strengthen families. So the families piece. Evidence, mentioned that before. It's not that everything we invest in has to already have the gold standard of evidence that it absolutely works. That's not what it means. It means, are we using the best available evidence in order to make a decision about what we're going to invest in? And if we're going to invest in something, will it contribute to the evidence? So a lot of what we do ought to build the range of evidence that we have. Now the third one is the toughest one, because you can get through the first two pretty easily, families and evidence, you can make a case, et cetera. The third one is tough because it's about scale. And what does that really mean? And why do we care about it? When we use the term scale, what we mean is that the intervention has the possibility, if it works well, or the idea has the possibility, if it works well, or the policy, or whatever it is, to change outcomes for whole populations of children and families. That's a huge bar. There are lots of good things you can do at the program level, and you can have a great charter school, for example. But is it replicable? Can you take it to other places? Can you take it into the broader public school system? That's a scale question. In other words, can you take it to a level where whole populations will be affected? The entire neighborhood, an entire city, the entire country. That's a real tough one to get past, and you will often see us invest for a while and then decide, no, we're going to either spin that off into somebody else who's going to work on it, we're going to stop doing it because it doesn't have a path towards scale. Now remember what I said earlier about patience? Doesn't mean we decide that real quickly, but if we can't figure out how something's going to go to scale, then eventually we're going to stop funding it. So I'm going to end just with response to a question that I got a few times when I first came into this job, where somebody said, well, that's all well and good, Patrick, but what are your personal priorities? And of course I said, well, everything I just said is a personal priority. I want to be doing the job. But what they meant, I think, is, so what are you going to be thinking about, the last day when you close the door and turn off the lights and you go off into retirement? What are you going to be looking back on and say, that's something that I really wanted to make sure that we got done, in addition to all the work that we're all doing together? And there are a few things, some of these are boring, but I think it's just fair for you to know about them. I believe strongly that the people right here in this room, and when we have staff meetings, the people in the whole room, people are going to be here long after I've retired. You're going to actually have a lot better ideas than we've had up to now. You're going to be smarter than we were. You're going to be more ambitious than we were. You're going to be reacting differently to a more complicated world than we ever reacted to. And that means that I want you, as part of the Casey Foundation, to have the resources you need to put those ideas into action. We can't get there if we don't have a kind of fiscal discipline today. That means that we're saving money so that the ideas that you have 5 years from now and 10 years from now and 15 years from now, we've got the resources to take them forward. So one of the things is that I wanted to make sure, and I still want to make sure, that our spend rate, This is the boring part. Our spend rate fits with our endowment. So we're not spending the endowment down so that when you've got a great idea, sorry, we don't have enough money left to take that idea forward. So the right level of fiscal discipline is important to me. Second, you've probably already heard a lot about how all organizations, and particularly this one, we can get siloed. We're each working in our own particular area. We've got these two buildings. It's kind of hard to bring them together. You know, how do we get synergy across the different kinds of work that we do? Because after all, poverty, permanence, and place, they are all interconnected, right? So how do we bring that together? How do we work together in a different way? How do we have this kind of entrepreneurship on the one hand, but the teamwork on the other hand? How do we make that work? I don't have any glib answers for that. We're just going to keep working away at it. I think we're making progress. I think it's slower than I'd like, but we're making progress, so that's something I care a lot about. Third, and this should be close to your hearts, we are in the middle of, and we will continue, a major transition in this foundation. We have a lot of folks like myself and John and Donna and Bart, who you heard from yesterday, and lots of other folks, been here for a long time. We have lots of new blood coming in. So that sort of succession into the important roles up and down the foundation, at every single level of the foundation, making that succession, that transition process successful so that people feel welcomed and they take up the work is one of the things I care an awful lot about and want to invest in. And finally, and in many ways, if nothing else works, protecting the culture. A lot of what you talked about earlier is about the culture of this place. It's clear to me that you can have all the kind of written personnel policies and other kinds of policies, and you can have rules and regulations, and you can have hierarchy and organizational charts and all that kind of stuff. And culture trumps all of that. You know, you have a good culture, you can kind of work your way through whatever other problems you have, but you have to have a good culture. And the things that we've talked about, staying mission-driven, that we in fact are here because we care about a mission deeply. This notion that you talked about earlier about healthy debate, so we continually kind of raise up where we've got healthy conflict that we can work through, but do that in a respectful way. All the different kinds of meaning of the term respect, again, that was mentioned earlier, that entrepreneurship, that kind of teaming that we talked about, all those things, that hard work, all those things you talked about earlier, I see as our collective job, but I feel a special responsibility towards protecting that so we can hand it off to the next generation of Casey folks who are going to make this place even stronger. So there you have it. That's what I see as Casey today from my point of view at least, and I wish I could stay the rest of the day. I should quickly say I apologize for not being here yesterday. I had to be in Detroit, so I missed the free food and everything. But I also wish I could have been here listening on the panel. It would have been fun. So got some time for questions. Great, terrific. Or comments or whichever.
I've been pretty struck the past couple of days by this idea that there was once a time that Casey approached the work without families as central, and that that's not the norm. Because to me, it seems like such a given that if you're going to do effective, sustainable work for kids, families have to be part of it. And am I mishearing?
So that's a good question. I'm trying to think. So I've been here like 18 and a half years. So when I first arrived, I picked up a very strong family vibe, if you will. I think a little too much oatmeal this morning. I think what I would say is that in the earliest days of the foundation, we may not have articulated it in quite the way we do now. And certainly we've, I think, done a better job of articulating the importance of families, you know, for quite a while. It's at least 10 or 15 years. I think it may have been at the point where Making Connections was being designed, the neighborhood transformation, family development, that Ralph and Doug and many others kind of started to talk very explicitly about children do better when families do well, and families do better in supportive communities, that kind of bumper sticker. But well before that, I mean, that's when we really lifted up, but well before that, I mean, to me, this was part of the take. I don't know if Doug would agree with this. I thought Doug was being very tactically smart. You remember, this is before welfare reform, and this is when there was a lot of beating up of poor families. That, you know, the children were blessed with halos around them, but those parents. It was like that kind of a deal. And so Doug was really trying to work on the idea that we've got to provide economic supports, social supports, a range of supports for families, and we've got to respect them and bring them in as part of the solution. And the way that he would talk about that in the earliest days that I can remember, and you know, Donna can help me out here of misremembering this, was in a way that talked about the importance of helping parents in order to help children. There was a line, I won't get it exactly right, but it was a terrific one that had to do with if you want children to have a better tomorrow, then you have to help their parents have a better today, or something on that. Or if you care about children's future, you got to care about their parents' present, all that kind of stuff. That goes way, way, way back. I think we've just talked a lot more about it in the last 10 or 15 years, but that's my recollection. Would you agree, Donna?
Yeah, I think I would say in the early days, particularly in the juvenile justice work, there was a real emphasis on the system, not so much the kids, except for how they were being harmed, but less about the connection of those young people to their families. I think that arc has changed over time.
Yeah.
But also, when I think about Plain Talk, Plain Talk was an early initiative to engage young people in healthy sexual behavior, or by getting adults in their communities involved. So it was about adults and family members helping kids make good decisions about their sexual activity. We didn't specifically say families because we were actually thinking about adults in community. So I think you will see, I think in our early work, attention to adults and their interaction with kids, and over time, more clarity in defining those adults as family members.
Yep. I think the Mental Health Initiative also had a strong, I know it did because I ran it, strong family engagement piece to it. Family to Family, the Child Welfare Initiative was very much around both family preservation, family reunification, and permanence for children in family settings. So there certainly, it was there. I just think the kind of lifting up of the theme is we've gotten better at, hopefully, over time. Other questions?
How does the vision that you just described of Casey jive with what you think the external understanding of Casey is, and how would you go about addressing any gaps between those two?
Yeah, it's a great question. My own take on this, and be interested in yours actually, but my own take on this is that people, I mean, Casey's sort of like the elephant in the blind man. People know Casey based on the work that they do in a particular area. So it's interesting when I've met people. One, most folks know us by the NPR ad. It's the general public, you know. So it's like we give this little bit of money to NPR, and people think that's what we do. You know, some people know us as the Kids Count folks, and they sort of think that's the major thing that we do. Other folks work more in the policy arena, and so they identify us with all of our policy work related to poverty and opportunity, because that's where they are. So it depends a whole lot. I mean, even fairly well-informed people often only know a piece of Casey. So the question is, would we be better positioned if we could figure out ways to in less complicated ways than I just did, talk about things in a more integrated kind of a way. It's part of why I came up with the 3 Ps. I figured, well, at least instead of a long Chinese menu, if you will, of like, here's 100 things we do, at least we could say, well, these are the 3 results that we care about, and they interact. but we're not there yet. We're not really to the elevator speech yet. And again, maybe we don't have to worry about that so much, but I think it would help us if people understood that better.
This is more of a personal question. What are some of the 3 pointers you can give somebody starting their career here to be successful? How can you grow in your career? How can you be successful?
Sure. When people ask me that type of question, and I have 4 young adult children, and not that they ask me, but I tell them as if they had asked me, like, what do you need to be successful? There's something that, I'm going to tell you the Cal Tyler story because it's one that always comes to mind. Cal Tyler is a guy who grew up in East Baltimore and started working on the loading dock at UPS. And he went from the loading dock to being a supervisor, went from a supervisor to being a truck driver for UPS, and truck drivers make good money at UPS. Went from there to being a manager, went from there to being a district manager, being a hub manager, being a regional manager. And by the time he retired from his career, he was the chief operating officer for all of United Parcel Service. The guy grew up here in East Baltimore, right? Pretty great story. So we were having a conference with a bunch of young people, and we decided to do this kind of fishbowl kind of panel where these are young folks coming out of foster care, and we'd have Cal sit mic'd in a casual kind of setting with 3 or 4 young people asking him questions, and he would respond. And one of the first questions one of the young people asked is, how did you do it and how can I be successful? There is a point to the story, I promise you. And so Cal, who is just a wonderful man, he was on our board at this point. Cal sort of, looked back and said, well, I just did my job. And then he stopped. And so this earnest young person said, can you say more? And he said, well, I came every day and I really just tried to do the best job that I possibly could in the job that I had. And, you'd think that'd be like, everybody does that. But, not a lot of people do that. So I just, whatever job they gave me, I just did that job. I never worried about the next job or the next job. I just worked, real hard on the job that I was doing. And, I guess I did all right. And, there's something so simple and straightforward about that I would encourage all of us to reflect on rather than just go right past. There's something about thinking deeply about the job that you have and the contribution it makes to the overall organization and what it is about that job and your role in it that you can actually make a huge difference in whatever that job is that day that you're working on right now. And I have to honestly say this has been my own experience at Casey. I came in as a program officer, and I tried to do a great job as best as I could, and noticed that lots of folks around me were doing the same thing, so that was kind of easy. And I got some opportunity for broader responsibilities just because I was working as hard as I could on the job that was right in front of me. So that's kind of the, what's those things they stitch, those little sayings that they stitch. That's like the answer that I would rely on the most. In particular at Casey, I really would encourage everyone here, you've all been incredibly successful in things you've done before you got here, and you're used to lots and lots of success. And there's a way in which this place can make you feel like, whoa, I'm, like, I was like a superstar, and now I don't feel like a superstar. What the heck? Who messed up my career path here? And let that go, man. Just let it go. Just recognize that it's going to be 6 months and maybe 9 months before you're comfortable enough to feel like your old self. The first time you write something, you get it back, and it's covered with, edits. Or the first time you think you did a good job, and somebody said, "Well, that was good, but you got to do better." Say like, "That's great." Don't get discouraged about it. Don't feel underappreciated, all of that. So this is a place that if you're patient and if you do that sort of Cal Tyler thing day in and day out, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. Other questions?
That's hard to follow up on. That's a good question. But my question is, I'm a big believer in the civic sites.
Uh-huh.
Are there any What would be the threshold to take that to scale?
That's another really great question. So our civic sites are a particular kind of opportunity for us in that these are places where we try to take lots of different things that we do all over the country and kind of concentrate them in a particular place. So there are two answers actually to your question. One is that in this country we have very few examples of where a community has moved from being concentrated poverty community to being a true mixed income community of opportunity. We've got lots of examples where it's gone from concentrated poverty to gentrified so that folks who used to live there can't afford to live there. We have lots of examples of attempts to change communities where it doesn't change and you still have concentrated poverty and concentrated disadvantage. So we've got lots of that. We've got a few around the country, just a few, where we've been able to get to a mixed income community of opportunity. We'd like to see Baltimore and East Baltimore and Atlanta in the NPUV be examples of that so that it influences the field. So that's the first answer is these are really model sites that hopefully will influence the rest of the field, and that's a path towards scale. The more nuanced answer, in my view, is that in the course of trying to make this work, and it's, this is probably a 30-year process, right? Sorry about that, but it's probably a 30-year process. We're about 10 years in East Baltimore and about the same in Atlanta. So we're talking 20 years, right? But in that process, we're discovering things that themselves can immediately be useful. So in East Baltimore, something that we call responsible redevelopment. We had a situation where you are using eminent domain to move 735 households. The way it usually goes is, they get a letter and they say the federal government requires us to give you this for your house. You've got until such and such a time to move. We didn't do that. We actually had the basic rule that the families had to be better off rather than worse off after the move process. And so their average equity for the homeowners went up by about $125,000 because of what we did. We did a range of things around responsible relocation as part of that. Usually, a common thing is when you tear down buildings, there's some minimum environmental protections that are there. We ended up in East Baltimore. Some of the academics came to us and said there's lead, there's asbestos, there's all these problems. The usual approach isn't enough. And so with their consultation and expert advice, we put together a protocol for responsible demolition that actually has now become the standard in the state. So that's like another example of a path towards scale. The work in Atlanta with the early childhood through elementary school towards grade level reading, that will influence the other things that we do. I don't see us, for me, Casey's not going to invest as much money in other communities as we do in East Baltimore and Atlanta. I mean, we're not going to try to scale it up that way, but it's how do we take the lessons and really make sure they get into the field and that the field is picking them up. Partnerships with HUD, partnerships with Promised Neighborhoods, et cetera. But that's a good, tough question. Yeah.
Well, everyone, please join me in thanking Patrick.